title says, I have a question. When did predictability become bad in pro wrestling? And this has somewhat to do with the pay-per-view that was yesterday, but also with, this has been something I've noticed probably the last 6 months, where people just completely complain that things are too predictable, and that because they're predictable, they suck, or that they're not very good. And my question is, when did that become a bad thing? When did predictability become a bad thing? Because I don't think it is. I've said this numerous times, but I'm going to actually try to do a whole video on this, talking about this, because, and maybe it's just me, because I've watched pro wrestling since I was 3 or 4 years old, and there's very little I have not seen. There's very little things that truly shock me, particularly now with the internet, and the fact that, most of the true surprises we don't normally get very much of. But, all of that said, I would ask, when did predictability just become a bad thing? I just don't get it. Anyway, just from a point of that, I've watched wrestling for a very long time, and even before I would say the internet, there was a lot of things that didn't totally shock me. I could pretty much call a lot of what I thought the outcomes of matches were, just because I'd watched enough wrestling where I could pretty much tell going into a match who I thought was going to win, and where I thought that the company was going. So, to that extent, it's been a very long time since I would say that wrestling was totally unpredictable for me. And in some ways, I think wrestling is not predictable enough in a lot of ways. And that too often wrestling tries to get cute and not give people necessarily what the right outcome would be, because the right outcome is the predictable outcome. To me, you can go out there and you can have Triple H take on Jamie Noble, and the predictable outcome is going to be Triple H is going to beat Jamie Noble. However, if you go out there and you have Jamie Noble and Triple H put on a decent 10-minute match, now some people would say that right there nulls the predictability, because you would think that Triple H would just go out there and squash him, and there's truth to that. But that's kind of my point. Knowing how something's going to end, or being able to see how something's going to end, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how you get to there. That's the bad thing. And I don't think anyone necessarily can predict that part of it. And when you can start predicting that part of it, that becomes the problem. As most people have noticed, if you look behind me, you see a whole stack of DVDs. Most of what you see behind me is actually just movies. Most of the wrestling DVDs are scattered elsewhere because I don't have enough room on that shelf for my wrestling DVDs. I love all sorts of movies. Most of the movies you'll see back there, a lot of them are sci-fi-ish, but there's also a lot of like caper movies, mystery, suspense movies, slasher-type films, all of that sort of thing. I have a bad habit, and maybe this is just me talking, and maybe this is part of the problem. Maybe this is why I don't understand when a lot of people bring this criticism up. Of when I go to a movie, even if I don't know anything about the movie, I can sit down at the movie theater, watch the movie, particularly if it's something that is mystery-filled, and probably 10, 15 minutes into the movie, I pretty much know how the movie's going to end. I know who the bad guy really is. I can pretty much see most of the major plot twists coming. A bad habit of that. My friends despise it, because I will sit there in the movie center and go, oh, it's this guy, and then they go, shut up, because they know I'm usually right. So for the most part, it takes a lot to really surprise me as far as movies go. And if you watch most movies are very formulaic. Even the best movies are very formulaic. If you go and you watch Unforgiven, with Clint Eastwood, which is considered this great epic Western. I don't consider it that, but a lot of people do. That is the definition, in my opinion, of a formulaic movie. You can see the formula laid out. It's a very basic story. It's a very formulaic story. If you look at the Harry Potter books and the Harry Potter movies, those are very formulaic. The same thing pretty much happens in the movie or in the stories the exact same way throughout each movie. The stories are a little different, but the same. But it's pretty formulaic as far as that go. If you watch most TV shows are very formulaic in the way they're set out. Most sitcoms are very formulaic. You pretty much know that you're going to get the lovable goof is going to somehow save the day or turn out to be right, or is going to be made to look like the fool, or being caught looking like the fool. You pretty much know how things are going to end. And most people like that. If you watch most mainstream things, if you ask most people that would be considered mainstream, that's what they like. That's what they want to watch. I've mentioned this before, but there's a show in the U.S., and I believe it's in the U.K. as well, Battlestar Galactica. In the U.S., it airs on Sci-Fi. It is considered by a lot of people to probably be one of the best shows on TV. Almost nobody watches it. Why? Because it's not formulaic. Because it has a lot of things going on. It has a lot of mystery and suspense to it, and a lot of weird plot twists that throw a lot of people for loops, and people don't necessarily like that sort of thing. People watch, people love, people talk about reality TV because of the spontaneity of reality TV. And that is true, but also I would say reality TV is also very formulaic in itself, because we know how people act. We can see someone say, oh, well, this goof is going to act stupid when this happens, and people like that. People like predictability in a lot of things, and it's not a bad thing. And I don't really get this whole notion of, if a match is predictable, if the outcome is predictable, not the match, but if the outcome is predictable, then that already means that the match is no good, or the match suffers from it. I don't necessarily think so. Now, I think if a match has an unpredictable ending that works and is good, that helps a match a lot. But I don't think a predictable outcome necessarily hurts a match. Now, if a match is ploddingly predictable throughout the match, then yes, that's not a good thing. But you can have a predictable outcome and not necessarily have a predictable match. And it's just one of those things that really kind of gnaws on me a little bit, because like I said, and maybe it's just me, because I am one of these people who there's very few movies that I don't see the ending coming. There's very few movies that I'm surprised by the ending. There's only a handful of those movies, and it's stuff like there's stuff where there's no way you could necessarily see how the ending's going to come. You have like the Ocean 11 movies where they're going to get away with it, but the question is, how are they going to get away with it? Then you have stuff like The Usual Suspects. If you've never seen The Usual Suspects, The Usual Suspects has this whacked out, crazy ending that to this day I mark out for, because the guy that I thought was the legit bad guy at the beginning of the movie, I said, oh, well, he's got to be the legit bad guy. Well, by the end of the movie, they convinced me it wasn't, and then it turns out to be him anyways. Hope I didn't ruin the movie. So hopefully most of you have seen that. Memento, if any of you have seen Memento, that movie is, again, it was very hard to see how the ending was going to become because of the way the movie is set up. That's a movie that I love because the ending is somewhat unpredictable. But things like that. But, unpredictability is a good thing in some regards, but it's very rare to have true unpredictability because it has to work. I mean, you have stuff that's, unpredictable just to be unpredictable, and then it just doesn't work, and it's like, well, why did they do that? That wasn't very good. And it's one of those things that I would say over the last 6 months has really just made me kind of question what people mean when they say, well, I saw this coming a while away, so it wasn't as good as it should have been. And I'm like, well, is that a bad thing? I mean, if Christian had been the guy, if it had been announced that Christian was the guy who was attacking Jeff, I think most people would have liked that. And that was very predictable. We had known that for, a couple of months that that's what was going to happen. I don't think most people thought that was a bad thing. I think that even though people said, well, it's a little too predictable, much like the WWE felt like it was, but I still think most people would have been okay with it, and I think that's the ending that most people wanted, and I think most people were kind of let down by that, even though I think WWE has done a good job of kind of covering it up. But, so there is an example. And like I said, there's very few times, I can even think probably since the 90s, even before I was on the internet, where I was truly surprised at outcomes of matches, or that outcomes of matches were just totally shocking to me, because I pretty much could see how things were going, how things were going to end, and it was more of, well, how are you going to take me there? And maybe that's my mindset, and maybe my mindset is just different from a lot of other people's, in that I'm more worried on how are you going to get me to the ending than what the actual ending is a lot of the time. Because I can even put up with somewhat of a ending if the journey there was at least pretty good. I can forgive to some degree a just kind of a lackluster ending, not a necessarily bad ending, but kind of a lackluster ending. But I think that sometimes people seem to discredit the ending of a match because they say, oh, well, I saw that coming. Well, is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, because you anticipated it, was that a bad thing? And if it, to me, wrestling is very predictable. Pro wrestling is very, very predictable in a lot of ways. There's very few times where you go into a match and you're really, okay, who's going to win, who's going to win, and who's going to win. There's who you would like to win, but I think if people think of it logically, there's very few times where you're going to see, where you're actually going to go, okay, by the time you get to the match, you're going to feel like, okay, I honestly don't know who's going to win. I think most of the time you feel like, okay, this guy is probably going to win, even though I would much rather this guy win. But, so that's just kind of more of a question I have out there. Is it a bad thing? Because I don't think it is. I think that predictability is a good thing. I think you can show that it's a good thing. I think that a lot of things in mainstream culture are, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, but I think there's a reason why people like predictability, and I think that sometimes you have to sell predictability because, and I've said this I don't know how many times, if you make things entertaining but predictable, then when you actually do something that is unpredictable, it definitely adds a little bit more excitement, it definitely adds a little bit more awe to what you've done. And I think that is, to some degree, probably what is missing, because I definitely feel that in pro wrestling as a whole, there's way too much of, let's just be unpredictable. In my opinion, that's why I started to hate the NWO angle, was because they were just adding guys just because, okay, well, who's the one guy that we can add who people go, oh, wow, I can't believe he was added to it, to try to build off of, that Hulk Hogan joining the NWO thing, which was a fairly big shock, even though most of us on the internet knew that's what was going to happen, but most of us didn't necessarily believe it. It was like, oh, is that really going to be what? I'll believe it when I see it, type of thing. But after that, when you had guys like the Giant join instead of Lex Luger, I've talked about this before. I thought that was, to me, that's when I really started to question where they were going with and that was very early. That was very early in the angle, what they were doing, and the fact that they didn't bring in DDP, and the fact that because that was seen as too predictable, and they wanted to keep everything totally unpredictable. And I think that it got to a point where people started expecting the unpredictable to happen, and I think that becomes a problem as well. And then they didn't know how, because then people are expecting the unpredictable, and then when you start doing things that are predictable, it hurts the product to an extent, or it hurts the story you're trying to tell, because people are too used to you throwing them unpredictable, and then it kind of, it's not as effective, I would say. So there's an example. The original ECW, I think that in near its death, I would say that Paul Heyman was trying to do things that were unpredictable. In spite of it, I think he was trying to, keep trying to wow the fans instead of just doing what necessarily maybe the fans wanted and what was predictable even to the fans, even though it was a smart crowd, because I think even they would have gone along with it. So I think that hurt that promotion. I think that I just don't buy into this argument that if something is predictable, that you have to discredit it, because but like I said, maybe it's just me, maybe it's just the way I think, because like I said, I'm used to watching things in my mind that I see as predictable, and so I'm more worried about, okay, how are you going to get to the end? How are you going to get to there? And maybe most people don't think of that. Maybe most people could care less how you get to the end, and the end is all that's important. And if that's the case, then I guess that's the case. But I just wanted to come on here and kind of ask that question, I guess, because it's been something I would say over the last 6 months has really kind of bugged me in a lot of ways. Is predictability really a bad thing? I don't think it is. I think it's something that is greatly needed to a large degree. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be predictable but still entertaining. And that's kind of the trick. But to just but I just don't buy this. If something is predictable, then it necessarily is a bad thing. I don't necessarily buy that. So, but anyways, I thought I would just come on here and ask that question and see what you guys thought. So with that, I am out. Later.